The pandemic has many people in Massachusetts struggling with the cost of necessities from housing to food, but there's also concern about access to water and sewer systems. According to a report by the State Advisory Committee to the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, the concerns about water and sewer service are especially acute for people of color and low income. To tell us about what the report calls a looming crisis are a member of the committee from East Boston, Dr. Neenah Estrella-Luna, and from Lawyers for Civil Rights, Staff Attorney Lauren Sampson. Thank you both very much for joining us.
Thank you for having us, Chris.
Thank you for having us.
I'll just start with Dr. Estrella-Luna. You call this maybe a looming problem and an actual problem. So what does that add up to exactly?
Well, what we found basically is that the way that water is managed in Massachusetts and provided to folks, the way that it is all structured, it's structured for inequities. And so what the Civil Rights Commission is primarily concerned about are people's civil rights and where there may be disparities, particularly for protected groups. And what we looked at when we looked at water shutoff policies, lien policies, and affordability programs is that they are structured in such a way that racial disparities for linguistically isolated groups, and for low-income peoples in Massachusetts are almost inevitably going to be there. And so the scale of the problem is statewide, but the scale of the problem is also very acute in places like Boston, where we have large numbers of people of color, a large population of linguistically isolated folks, and large low-income populations.
Yeah, Lauren Sampson, as far as the legal landscape here, you would think that water is like a utilities. And, right now, whether it's electricity or natural gas, you have these moratoriums. Even before there was a pandemic, you had that to protect people from shutoffs. So does it work like that for water or not?
Thank you, Chris. And what we found at Lawyers for Civil Rights is that water is in kind of a unique position. First, primarily, water is handled by landlords rather than tenants, who are, as Neenah pointed out, disproportionately people of color, people who are low income, people who are immigrants. And so they often don't have recourse if a landlord, for example, is unable to or chooses not to pay a bill. In addition, most water in Massachusetts is provided through cities and towns rather than the investor-owned utilities managed by the Department of Public Utilities. So the moratoria that were in place don't apply to those city and town water boards, which means folks don't get those protections.
And coming back to Dr. Estrella-Luna, what about what happens? Let's say it's the property owner who falls behind, and there's a possibility of a shutoff. What does that mean for the tenant exactly? What can the tenant do about that?
Nothing. The tenant, there is no legal recourse for the tenant under current Massachusetts law.
And coming back to Lauren Sampson, what have you been hearing from people, at least whether you've been working with them directly or indirectly, about the difficulties they're going through right now?
What we've heard at Lawyers for Civil Rights is that there is this patchwork scheme across the Commonwealth of different ways of accessing water and different ways of accessing your rights about water. For example, in Lynn, we heard about a pregnant woman and her family who had their water shut off during the pandemic because the landlord went through bankruptcy and stopped paying their bills. And it took legal intervention to get the water turned back on. That is absolutely unacceptable that the tenants had no other recourse, as Neenah says, under present Massachusetts law.
Coming up to Estrella-Luna, that's the process part of the story. What's it like to live with that? The water's not there. It takes time to resolve this. What does that do to your life?
Well, in a pandemic, it's a massive public health issue. I mean, water is life. And so if you have no access to water, you have no ability to stay healthy. You have no ability to stay safe. And it's also an issue of dignity. I mean, we already have challenges with people having access to enough water. We have high schools, both in Boston and across the Commonwealth, that are allowing students to take showers in their gyms because they don't have access to water at home. So this is a pre-existing problem that's just made worse by the pandemic, and it's made worse by the lack of oversight and the lack of accountability.
Well, Lauren Sampson, compared to tax bills or even some electric bills, the water and sewer charges might not seem that big, but what's trending with that? Are they getting bigger than they were before, maybe?
You know, what we're seeing at Lawyers for Civil Rights is this constant amalgamation of different costs. So things that you might not realize that all add up together. For example, water restart fees. If the water is shut off, someone has to bear the cost of restarting that water process. And that, even if it seems like a small cost, is incredibly burdensome to families who are suffering through the pandemic, through record unemployment, and through things like food and housing insecurity. So all of that combined together has created the perfect storm for our client communities.
Going back to Dr. Freya Luna, one of the other things that's going on here that I haven't paid attention to lately is that water and sewer systems historically have depended on help from Washington. Some of them are pretty old. They need to be fixed up or maybe even extended. How has that been playing out lately?
Yeah, that's what one of the things that we found from the folks who testified to the advisory committee is that that is a huge source of these problems. So most water districts across the country, and particularly here in Massachusetts, where we have very old water systems, relied on federal assistance for both maintenance and repair and replacement. I mean, we still have wooden water pipes in different parts of Massachusetts and in different parts of Boston. As for the last couple of decades, and to some extent longer, that kind of money has been ratcheted back, and the state has not stepped up in terms of replacing those funds or assisting cities and towns. And so because the cost of water, the water rates are determined at the local level, at the city and town level, at the district level, without state support, then all of those costs then are put on the ratepayer or put on the property owner themselves. And tenants have no ability to have any kind of protections from any of that. Even,
Lauren,
by the way, even in the water affordability programs themselves, because if a landlord does have access to a water affordability program, there's no requirement that they extend that discount to the tenants in their rents.
And what's the solution? I mean, do you address that at a local level, or do you need to go to statewide?
There are a couple of possibilities that we've explored at Lawyers for Civil Rights. One of them, of course, is that the Massachusetts Constitution guarantees a right of access to water. And while traditionally that's been thought of as a right to access to public water, things like, you know, green spaces and blue seas, we want to see that really thought of as a right to access to water in your home, in your community, and in your life. Another possibility is to have programs similar to that, like LIHEAP, the Low Income Heating Assistance Program, available for folks who need assistance with their water and with their sewage. A similar program did operate at one point in time, but has since been discarded. If that were to be funded again, especially during the pandemic, it could be hugely helpful for those families who are struggling right now.
Dr. Freya Luna, the advisory committee has also called for collecting more data around the problem. What would that mean exactly?
Well, it would mean one very important thing. It would mean that we could actually determine much more definitively than we can now the scale of the problem and who is actually being affected. We have no idea, for example, who are the people who are having their water shut off? What is their racial background, their income background, their linguistic abilities? We have no idea who's getting access to the water affordability program. So we don't know if there are disparities there. And we don't know who's suffering from or who has had liens put on their homes as a result of not paying their water bills. So we can't even say and fix the problem of disparities because we can't definitively determine that it's there yet. Our data suggests that it is, and we're structured for disparities, but we can't address the problem until we know exactly where it's at.
Lauren Sampson, one other question here is about the accountability for water. Here in Boston, we have a local commission. It's nominally independent of the city, but it's run by a board appointed by the mayor. So it is sort of politically sensitive. Is that enough accountability, or are we looking at a whole other situation in many communities throughout the state?
What we found at Lawyers for Civil Rights is that accountability and transparency must be improved at the water district level. To give just one example, both Worcester and Lynn told Lawyers for Civil Rights that they had not engaged in any water shutoffs during the pandemic, even though we knew of specific instances where families had their water shut off in both cities. To force advocates to go through these lengthy pub processes of trying to extract public records from water districts that won't be forthcoming about what they're doing is unacceptable and untenable.
Okay. Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was Lauren Sampson from Lawyers for Civil Rights and Dr. Neenah Estrella-Luna from the Advisory Committee.